Welcome back, fellow learners. This is class number 5 in our Learn CSS Once and For All series, which of course is part of our larger web development offering. Our focus today is Flexbox, which enables us to lay out our HTML elements in an effective and repeatable way. We will learn what Flexbox is, how to use it. We'll cover all the core associated properties and work through multiple examples, making manipulations to our code and viewing the results to really drive it home. Come along, let's learn together. So Flexbox is a layout model for displaying items in a single dimension, as in a row or a column. So when we say single dimension, we are saying you can use Flexbox for one dimension at a time. So either the row or the column. This is in contrast to a two-dimensional model, which would deal with controlling both the column and row at the same time. Flexbox wasn't constructed to do this. We will see that we have another system for doing this called the grid layout system in a later class. It makes laying out web page components easy. Flexbox is all about two different axes. There is a main one and there is a cross axis. The main axis defines in which direction your layout will be constructed. So that's either east to west or north to south, or in the reverse direction, west to east, south to north. The cross axis runs perpendicular to the main axis. If your main axis is set to row, your cross axis will run across the columns, and vice versa. Understanding which axis is which is important when we start to look at aligning and justifying the flex items. Flex items are those things that come inside of a flex container. More about that in a minute. The main axis is defined by the flex direction property. So you can either extend row-wise, so that's CSS inline direction, east to west, west to east, or column-wise. That would be the block direction, north to south, south to north. Those things will only make sense to you if you already know those terms or if you followed along with us up until this 5th class. So if you look here, I have two depictions. On the left-hand side, I have flow direction row. So that's left to right, right to left. The values for flex direction would be row or row reverse. And then on the right-hand side here, we have column. And the values there would be column or column reverse. Okay, stay with me. Don't get bored while we continue to define our terms. We'll jump into code in just a minute. So we have main access, main size, main start, main end. Let's make sure we have these under our belt. So main access is the direction in which your flex items travel. And again, that's east, west, north, south. The main size is the total number of flex items on the main axis. We can think of these as boxes inside of a container, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. Use this for reference to come back to. Main start is the position at which your first flex item shows up. And main end is the position at which your last item shows up. It's the end of the main axis. Stay with me. So we mentioned at the very beginning, there's two axes, right? There's the main one, that's the direction that your items flow, and then there's the perpendicular one, the cross axis. Now we will define cross axis. You will notice a theme. Cross axis is the direction in which your new flex items get stacked. So if we were wrapping them around in a container, think of them that way, this is the direction in which they get stacked, always perpendicular to the main axis. The cross size is the length of the content along your cross axis. The cross start is the line where the flex items begin to start stacking, and then your cross end is the line where the flex items complete their stacking. A little bit more to drive home the start and end lines. If the flex direction is row, and I'm working in the English language, then the start edge of the main axis will be on your left and the end edge will be on the right. If I were to be working in a language like Arabic, then the start edge of my main axis would be on the right and the end would be on the left. In both cases, the start edge of the cross axis is at the top of the flex container and the end edge is at the bottom, as both languages have a horizontal writing mode. All right, so now let's get into probably the two most important concepts, flex container and flex items. Okay, if we understand nothing else, let's understand this. An area of a document laid out using Flexbox is called your flex container. To create the container, we do this. So here we have a class that is called outside. So when we reference that, of course, in CSS, we use the leading period. Period, outside. In our curly brackets, we use display, : flex. So that tells me I'm going to be using Flexbox in an east to west convention. If I was going to use it top to bottom or bottom to top, I would do period outside display inline flex. So what that might look like in my HTML code would be over here. P class equals outside and then some kind of text, foo. Okay, so that's what my class would look like. And this is how I would apply Flexbox to that particular HTML element. So as soon as we do this and declare Flexbox in use, any direct children of that container, anything that would come inside of my outside element, would automatically be our Flex items or our Flex children. So we have this parent-child construct, and hold that throughout the whole rest of the presentation. So let's build on everything we've learned through the first 4 classes, and let's add Flexbox into the mix, and let's build this page here. One happy doggy. Okay, so let's spell out the elements that we're using to create this page before we actually look at the code. So along the top, I have a navigation bar. So I'm using one Flexbox element that way. Then for the title of the page, One Happy Doggy, I'm using text shadow with span tags on the first letter of each word to make that effect. Then I'm using Google Font for our fonts on the page to make them look nicer and have them pop. Middle element here, which is actually my second Flexbox, where I create main content with the Flex Grow, Flex Shrink, and Flex Basis properties. We're going to learn all about that. I'm using an image and vertically aligning that in the center. We learned that in a previous class. And then my third and final Flexbox is along the bottom, and I have only one Flex child there. In my first Flexbox, I have 5 Flex items. In my second one, I have 3, but in this last one, I only have 1 that goes across the top. And here also, I'm using the margin auto rule to center the body of our page. And finally, I just have a footer at the bottom of this page. And since I did this right before 2020, you see what I have. Okay, so let's walk through this section by section, starting on the right-hand side with our CSS. So obviously we have a body section, and I set the maxed width to 966 pixels to bring it in from its furthest positions left to right. I like to do that. And margin auto, of course, centers that, so it gives the equal amount of margin on the left and right-hand side. Then, of course, I'm using Google Fonts, so I'm using a font family or font face from Google Fonts there, and I have my background set to light gray. Then I have my nav class. Now this is for the navigation bar that you saw that goes across the top. So this is the parent element of our top navigation bar. And of course we know that because we're using display flex right here. The default for Flexbox is row-wise, east to west, as opposed to column north to south. I set the height to 30 pixels. I use the justifycontent property to space the navigation elements evenly. So justifycontent defines how the browser distributes space between and around content items along your main axis of the Flex container. I set my margin to 20 pixels. I then override the bottom margin to be 5 pixels less than this, and I align items in Flexbox. This controls the alignment of items on your cross axis. That's the perpendicular axis to my main axis. And I use that to center my Flex items vertically. All right, now I have my nav children, or my Flex items. The nav class's children are home, about, services, contact, and media. Now, it would have been smarter, since I'm going to style these all the same way, to just use one class and apply it to all of them, right? I didn't really have to do it this way. It's a little not dry, if you will. I'm repeating myself. I use the Flex properties on the children, Flex for short, in the following order of appearance in my CSS code. Flex Grow. This adds space around the main axis. This causes items to take up any available space. Flex items share this space with their other siblings. Flex Shrink. This controls how space is taken away. This can cause one Flex item to shrink at a size faster than one of its siblings. Then Flex Basis defines the size of each item in terms of the space available. And important here, and I'll make this note for many things, these 3 settings work in tandem to impact your Flex item or your children. They have dependency on each other. Now you can set them independently and not use the shortcut of Flex. It's not recommended, but you can do that. Very important that you take this and you go further than we did in this class. That's where the learning really happens and where you make it your own. Play with the code, see what the results are. I couldn't possibly detail all different scenarios, though I'm trying to be very comprehensive, so hopefully it helps. And then I also use the box shadow property, which adds a shadow effect around an element's frame. So this is similar to some of the shadow that we've used on text before. Now we get to the actual heading of the page, the one happy doggy text. And you see what I did here. In my H1 tag, I use a class called doggy, and then using span tags only to impact the first letter of every word, I'm able to change the font size of just that one letter and employ text shadow to get the effect that you saw there. So I have a second Flexbox on the page across the center section with 3 flex items traveling row-wise. You saw that when we popped up the picture the few times we did. Each one has a separate background color. So here I was forced to use a different selector or a different class. And the class I chose was A, B, and C, as you see them here. They're very similar. So notice on the second flex item, the one in the middle, I set the flex grow to auto instead of 1 to add more space for the picture to breathe. I also vertically align the image in that same section and adjust the margin and padding a little differently, just enough to let the background color peek through on all sides. I like the look of that one, so that's why I did it that way. Next, I have that third and final flex box that goes across with just one flex element. So this includes just the S1 class. The flex box is the solo class. The S1 is the one child class inside of it, or the flex item. Here I use the space around value for the justified content property that we used earlier. You may recall earlier that we used space evenly. Using space around provides a half size space on either end of the item, so it just looks a little different. And for my footer element, I center align the text. I use cursive fonts from Google Fonts, and I have the font size set to 20 pixels. The other thing I used here is if you're on Mac OS is the character viewer. You can bring that up by Command Control Spacebar to add some symbols to the footer just for some extra character. All right, that's how I created that page. Now we can make a change. Here, we're going to employ the flex direction property and use the row reverse value. Notice above that it reverses the order of the links when I use row reverse. So can an element be both a flex item and a flex container at the same time? The answer to that is yes. So now I've inserted a new aside section, which is a flex item, to the original outside class. However, aside is now also an inline flex container who has the following children inside: the C class, the C2 class, and the C3 class, which you see here on the right-hand side. And you'll notice that the orientation of aside, our inline flex container, is column-wise rather than row-wise, right? That's the difference between the two. And let's take a little peek at the code. So we have the outside class here at the top, and its flex items are class A, class B, and aside. And inside aside, of course, the classes C, C2, and C3. And you see in the CSS on the right-hand side, in the highlighted section in yellow, is where we display inline flex, as opposed to in outside, we have display flex. Now let's go through some other helpful Flexbox related properties. The first one we'll talk about here is Flexwrap. Very useful. This allows flex items or its children to wrap onto additional lines when the container's parent reaches its limits. So here we have an example of Flexwrap with a value of no wrap. So you see it overflows its container. The second line we have Flexwrap wrap as a value, and you see that it naturally just goes right around. Then we can have Flexwrap wrap reverse, where the newer items appear on top. That might be very useful in certain situations. Now, building on what we just saw, we have Flexflow, which is a shorthand for the combination of both flex direction, which we've seen before, and Flexwrap, which we were just exposed to in the previous slide. So if we have Flexflow as a property, the first value is the direction. The second value is the value for Flexwrap. So here you see that we have row, we're going out east to west, and we have no wrap, so it will overflow its parent's container. Then down here we have row and wrap, so it'll do just the same, go out east to west, but it does wrap around. And here we have, in this last example, we have column for our flex direction, so it's going to go north to south, and wrap reverse, with the more recent items wrapping to the left. If it wasn't reverse, they would wrap to the right. So they would build left to right. Instead, they're going to build right to left with the reverse property. Now, justify content we've seen before, but these three all fall under the heading of controlling the distribution of space. And I have some pictorials here to help us understand what these do. We're going to see examples of these in just a few slides. So justify content controls how items are placed along the main axis. So the first example we have here is flex start. Flex start groups them to the left, assuming that this is a flex item and not an inline flex item. Justify content center, and that's a mistake there. That should just be center, not flex center, for the value. That groups them obviously in the center. And then we have space evenly, and that distributes the space evenly around all the elements. Then we have aligning items. This controls how items are placed along the cross axis, all right, that perpendicular axis. And you see the three examples there. We have flex start, center, and stretch. Then we have align self, which is interesting. This gives the ability to align all flex items to its parent container, and its default is stretch, the value of stretch for align self. That's the same as auto. Then we have flex start, and again, that aligns it to the top of that container, and flex end would align it to the bottom. All right, and we're going to see these live to really drive these points home. And sticking with the themes of controlling the distribution of space, we have aligned content. This sets the distribution of space between and around content items along a Flexbox's cross axis. And think of it this way, and I'm showing it here. Examples here are played out using justify content. But what justify content does for the main axis, align content does for the cross axis. So you see it here, flex start groups them all up at the start. Flex end groups them all at the end. Center around the center. You see even the values are the same as for justify content. We're just working off different axes, right? Space between, it's going to force the first and last children to the outermost limits, and space around will put that even space around. We're going to see examples. All right, so let's drive all this home with many examples. We have our HTML on the side, partial HTML. You see a nav class in a div element, and then you see CSS on the right hand side. So let's look at the HTML first. So I have my nav class, which of course is going to be the parent element, and then we have a bunch of different classes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Hrefs that go nowhere. Within there, of course, those are going to be the flex items. Now we'll move over to the CSS. As I typically do, I set my body to a max width of 600. I set margin to auto, so I center my content in the middle of the page. Then for my nav class, which is my flex container, I have display flex. That's what lets me know it's a container, obviously. And then I have the justify content set to flex start. And this is the default. Flex start is the default for justify content. I have my border set padding. I am using Flexflow, which does the row and the wrap, which means it's the direction is row, right? The first value, wrap is the second, which wraps the content around. I have my height here set to 500 for the container, and then I have my 6 flex items set down here at the bottom. So you see what happens in this particular case. I'm using justify content with a flex start, and I wrap the content that would otherwise overflow this height of 500. So you see what happens. All my flex items align to the left-hand side, wrapping around. Okay, so what did I change on this page comparing it to the last one? So justify content is still set to flex start. I now impose space around on the align content. And remember, align content works on the cross axis. So this distributes, in this particular case, because it's space around, the items evenly. So they'll have that half space of size on either side of the items. And then just for fun, I impose text align center to the individual items. And you see it really shows up for that middle item there, where you see the text is clearly aligned center. So that's the difference. Now, instead of them being one right after the other, there's space in between. That's courtesy of the aligned content working on your cross axis. I said this earlier, but it bears repeating. What justified content is to the main axis, aligned content is to your cross axis. So the only change I made here from the previous slide is I now have changed justified content from aligning to the left, flex start, to space evenly. So you see the space evenly across my main axis happens right here. Follow the arrows in the purple, or the lighter purple, and then the deeper solid lines are my space evenly for the aligned content that we saw on the previous slide. So that's the difference here. You see that all of a sudden we are spaced evenly both on the x-axis and the y-axis. Okay, and I make two changes here. For justified content, we're using space between. So this distributes items evenly along the main axis. The first item is flush with the start, and the last item is flush with the end. Then we have a line item set to center. This will pack all the items around the center of our cross axis. So what did I do here to get this effect? We're only working across the main axis here with justified content, and that is set to a value of space evenly. So all items have equal space around them. Now you notice I did away with the align items setting, so that's why we have everything being the same height. There's nothing competing against that cross axis. So what's happening here? This is fairly pleasing to the eye, isn't it? Everything is commented out except for align items, which we know, we've used it before, it centers our elements on that cross axis, right? So there's space around these items evenly on the cross axis. And we know, even though justified content is grayed out, the default there would be flex start. So in essence, that's what we have here. It's very much like reading a book. Still, again, the only thing we have for space control here is align items set to stretch. Now, flex items are stretched such that the cross size of the item's margin box is the same as the line while respecting width and height constraints. If it wasn't for the padding that I have set here, the boxes would actually be touching while using stretch. And again, we're stretching north to south, right? Because align items works off that cross axis, not the main axis. So we're not stretching east to west. All right, and what am I doing here to get this output? So first of all, I went back to using justified content, which again, works off my main axis, and I set it to space between. So this sets space between my items. I'm also still using align item stretch. So why such a big difference? All I did to get this to look the way it does, to contrast from what we just saw, was to reduce both the flex items padding and margin significantly. So if you need anything that looks very bold and blockish, this is something that you can do. Now we'll focus on aligned self. So let's refresh ourselves here. This overrides a flex items align items value to align it, the flex item, to the parent container. So how am I overriding this? So you see right here, I'm still using align item center. I changed our styling just a little bit to make sure that we can see this clearly. Then down here, using the nth child selector, what I'm saying is I want every other child to be affected, starting with the second one. So it changes the center alignment of the cross axis, right, which that's what's dictated to align items, to end alignment on every other child in this container. And of course, I'm changing the background color just to make sure it really pops. So pretty cool stuff. Now let's take what we did just a step farther to make some more modifications. So adding to align self, we're going to use the flex property. Let's refresh ourselves because we've seen this earlier. This controls the flexibility to the flex items. Align self, along with many of the things we've just been talking about, apply to the container, the flex container, while the flex property is applied to the flex items themselves. So down here on the right-hand side in our CSS partial code, we have flex set to 1, 1, and auto. So we have growth, shrink, and flex basis in that order. And you see we go from this top guy with no flex settings to this bottom guy, which just, depends upon the effect that you want to get out of this. But if you wanted to use something like this, certainly if you had some kind of a pattern visually, the one on the bottom for my money just looks a little better. I wanted to also point out that for sure, instead of using flex 1, 1 and auto, if you're going to have it set this way, you can simply do flex : auto as a shortcut. So I keep playing with this because many times in the real world, this is what we do. You want a desired effect, and we're not really sure exactly what we need to do to get this. But I only made 2 small changes here to get this brick-like effect. So they look like bricks here, right? So I changed my max width to 200 pixels, and I set my Flexflow to wrap. It's row, of course, because that's the direction in which we're working, and then to wrap. And then I have this really pleasing, kind of cool effect. And I still have my nth child selector set for every other one. I can play with any and all of these. I'm just trying to show you how to build on some of these ideas to inspire you to now create some of your own, because that's where the real learning will happen for you. I tell you what, when you try to teach something, you really wind up learning it. I did not know about the order property, but there is an order property, and I'm using it here, building upon everything that we've just done. The order property is used to change the order of your flex items. By default, the order will follow however you have them laid out inside of your source code. A negative value for order will make the impacted flex items come first, right? Because by default, they're 0. So if I set it to -1, they come first. If I set it to a positive number, it will come after. So what I have here is, in the very first example, this is what we've seen before. No order is set here. Then in the middle one, I have the order set to 1. So the unaffected items will come first, and the ones that I have in this more muted greenish, yellowish in my nth child selector actually come second. But you see in the bottom example, where I now change the order to -1 on the nth child rule set I have here, now they come first. So everything that's applied in the nth child will show up with those items first, and then the existing items will come up, the unaffected items will come up second with the negative number. It's pretty cool. And here's one of the very best and most applicable uses of the order property that I have found. And I give full credit on page 650 of a phenomenal book, The CSS Definitive Guide by Mayer and Weil. I highly recommend this book. It's a wonderful resource that I use quite often. This code forces the active tab, we have tabs across the top, you can see them down here at the bottom where I show you the output, to appear first as it's displayed on the website, even though it's not created that way in our HTML document. As you can see right here, we have home, about, blog, career, and contact in that order. But when you look at the output here at the bottom of the page, blog comes first. So what's happening here? The blog tab is made active. And even though it appears as the third item in our navbar list, it appears first in the output below because the active class of our anchor tag is making use of a negative number, right? Number 1 in the order property, which, as we just explained in the last section, would be ahead of the default 0 numbers of its siblings, right? All siblings by default are 0. If I set my affected item to -1, it gets pushed to the front of the line. If I set it to 1, blog would be the last one in this list. It would be home, about, career, contact, and then blog. And of course, I'm changing the background color as well. So this is a perfect use case to really drive home where order could be so useful. There is so much we can do, and there's so much to learn. If only there were more hours in the day. And if you'd like to learn more about Flexbox, I give you another resource. One is the book that I cited. The other is, of course, the CSS Flexible Box Layout module by w3.org, and I give you the link here for that. Okay, coding family, thank you for watching till the end. If this class has helped you, consider helping me to continue to bring these classes to you and others. Helping is easy. Just do the following. First, subscribe to the Yogi Coder YouTube channel, and all you have to do is click on my little icon here on the lower right-hand side, and it'll bring up the subscription button right away. Next, you can leave whatever comments or questions you'd like. And finally, share this video on any and all social media channels with your friends and your colleagues. Thank you again for watching, and until we meet again, happy coding.